The bidding room went quiet the moment the auctioneer pulled up the last listing of the night, and I knew right away something was wrong with it, because nobody in that crowded hall wanted to look directly at the screen. I was sitting in the back row of Corvo Station's scrap exchange, a cold metal chair digging into my spine, my hands stuffed into my jacket, because the heating system on this station had been broken for 3 years and nobody bothered to fix it. My name is Ethan Cole, and at that point in my life, I owned exactly 1 working shuttle, a debt that followed me across 4 star systems, and a reputation for buying things nobody else wanted. The image on the screen showed a hull shape that made no sense. It was long, angular, dark gray with streaks of rust bleeding down its sides like old wounds. The auctioneer, a thin Velkari trader named Orsa, with too many eyes and not enough patience, read the listing in a bored voice. Lot 412, unregistered hull. Origin unknown, though flagged as possibly Terran. Non-functional, no warranty, no refunds. Opening bid, 1,000 credits. Laughter rippled through the room. Someone near the front shouted that they wouldn't pay 100 credits to tow that thing to a smelter. Another trader said the ship looked like it had been dead longer than most of the empires currently sitting in this room. I understood the joke. Everyone did. Terran ships were folklore at this point. Old stories parents told children to explain why certain sectors of space were still marked as forbidden on star charts. Humanity had vanished from galactic records generations ago, and whatever they built, whatever they were, had been buried under so much bureaucracy and fear that most species treated the word Terran the same way they treated ghost stories. I should have laughed along with everyone else. Instead, I found myself staring at the shape of that hull, and something about it refused to let go of my attention. It did not look broken. It looked like it was waiting. 1,000 credits, I said, before I could talk myself out of it. The room turned to look at me. Orsa blinked several of her eyes in surprise, then shrugged and repeated the number. Nobody raised against me, not because they respected my bid, but because nobody wanted to be associated with the joke of the night. 10 seconds later, the gavel came down, and I owned a ship that everyone else in that room considered a coffin. My friend Grace Whitmore caught up with me outside the auction hall, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between disbelief and concern. Grace ran a parts shop 2 docks over, and had bailed me out of more bad decisions than I wanted to admit. "Tell me you didn't," she said. I did. "Ethan, that hull has been sitting in the unclaimed yard for 6 years. Nobody could even get a reading on what it's made of. The last 3 people who tried to move it lost equipment." Lost equipment how? She hesitated, which told me more than words would have. Cutting tools stopped working near the hull plating. Sensors gave garbage readings. One crew said their tow cable snapped clean, like something sheared it from the inside. I should have felt worried. Instead, a strange kind of excitement built in my chest, the same feeling I used to get as a kid finding an old locked box in my grandfather's garage, knowing that whatever was inside it mattered, even if I could not explain why. "I'll take a look tomorrow," I told her. "You're going to get yourself killed poking around a dead hulk that even scrap dealers are scared of." "It's not dead," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "It's just been alone for a long time." Grace stared at me like I had lost my mind, and honestly, at that point, I could not have argued with her. That night I barely slept. I kept pulling up the auction listing on my tablet, zooming into every blurry image the previous salvage teams had managed to capture before their equipment failed. The hull had no visible seams where I expected them, no manufacturer markings, no registry chips, nothing that matched any of the 17 major shipbuilding standards used across known space. It was as if someone had designed it from a completely different set of rules. By morning, I had convinced myself this was either the best decision of my life or the last one. The unclaimed yard sat on the far edge of Corvo Station, tethered by magnetic clamps to a support arm that groaned every time a shuttle passed too close. Rows of dead ships floated in silence there, husks stripped of anything valuable, left to drift until someone paid the storage fee or the station finally sold them for scrap. My new ship sat at the very end of the row, isolated from the others, as if even the wreckage around it had tried to keep its distance. Up close, it was even stranger than the photos suggested. The hull stretched almost 200 meters, longer than most cruisers I had seen from the mid-tier fleets, yet it had none of the elegant curves those ships were known for. Everything about its shape screamed function over form. Thick plating, sharp angles, no decoration, no branding, nothing that suggested pride or artistry, only purpose. I docked my shuttle at what I guessed was an old airlock, though the mechanism looked nothing like any lock I had used before. There was no obvious release lever, no keypad, no scanner. Just a circular hatch with faint grooves worn into the metal, grooves that looked almost like handprints pressed there 1,000 times over. I placed my palm against the center of the hatch, out of curiosity more than expectation. Nothing happened. I exhaled, half relieved and half disappointed, and reached for my cutting torch instead. Before I could power it on, a low vibration rolled through the hull beneath my boots. So faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. The hatch split open, not violently. Not like a door being forced, it slid apart smoothly, silently, as though it had done this exact motion 1,000 times before and simply remembered how. I stood frozen at the threshold, torch still in hand, staring into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my shuttle entirely. Grace is never going to believe this, I muttered to myself, and stepped inside. The interior corridor was tighter than I expected, built for people either smaller than average or built like walking tanks, judging by the reinforced framing along the walls. My boots echoed against a floor grating that had no dust on it, no debris, nothing that suggested 6 years of abandonment. It looked recently maintained, which made no sense given everything the auction records claimed. My handheld scanner flickered uselessly at my hip, unable to identify the alloy composition of the walls around me. I had never seen a reading like it, numbers spiking and dropping erratically, as if the device itself could not decide what it was looking at. I moved deeper into the ship, following the corridor as it sloped downward, past sealed rooms with doors that had no visible handles, past support beams etched with symbols that resembled letters but did not match any alphabet I recognized. Every few meters, small lights embedded in the ceiling flickered weakly, as though something inside the ship was fighting to stay awake after a very long sleep. I found the bridge almost by accident, stumbling through a wide archway into a room far larger than I expected. Rows of dead consoles lined the walls, their surfaces cracked and dulled by time, yet even in ruin, the design suggested something deliberate. Every station faced a central chair positioned at the head of the room, elevated slightly above the rest, as if built for someone whose decisions mattered more than anyone else present. I approached the chair carefully, running my fingers along its worn edge. Faded lettering had been etched into a small plate near its base, so faint I had to angle my flashlight sideways to make out the shape of the characters. They were English letters. My breath caught in my throat. I had heard the theories before, the same way everyone had, whispered stories about humanity once existing among the stars, before disappearing entirely from galactic memory, their history scrubbed so thoroughly that most species treated their existence as myth rather than fact. I had never taken those stories seriously, nobody did, yet here I was, standing on the bridge of a ship built by hands that once wrote in the same language I used every single day. I traced the letters with my fingertip, spelling out a name I could not fully make sense of. Part of it had worn away, but what remained looked like the beginning of a ship class designation, followed by a string of numbers that meant nothing to me yet. Behind me, one of the dead consoles flickered. I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped my flashlight. The screen had lit up for less than a second, a faint blue glow pulsing weakly before fading back to black. My scanner beeped erratically at my hip, registering a brief spike in power output somewhere deep within the ship. "That's not possible," I whispered, mostly to convince myself. "This thing has been dead for years." The console flickered again. This time it stayed lit. I stood there in the dim light of that ancient bridge, heart pounding, torch forgotten in my hand, staring at a machine that everyone else in this sector had written off as scrap, and I understood with sudden, undeniable clarity that I had not bought a dead ship at all. I had bought something that was waking up, The console's glow steadied into a soft pulse, almost like breathing, and rows of unfamiliar symbols scrolled across its cracked surface faster than I could track. I backed away instinctively, my shoulder blades pressing against the cold metal of another dormant station, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Leftover battery cells discharging randomly, a malfunction triggered by my own scanner, some automated system responding to a change in cabin pressure. None of those explanations felt right, and deep down, I already knew it. I forced myself to breathe slowly, the way my grandfather taught me when I was young and terrified of thunderstorms. He used to say that fear only controls you if you let it make your decisions for you. I repeated that thought until my hands stopped shaking enough to lift my scanner again. The readings had changed completely. Where before there had been nothing but static and error messages, now there was a faint, steady hum of power moving through systems that should have been stone-cold dead for years. Whatever this ship was, it had not simply been sitting idle in that scrapyard. It had been waiting, conserving whatever fragments of energy remained inside it, holding on through years of silence for a moment, exactly like this one. I did not know why that thought sent a chill down my spine, instead of comfort. A soft chime echoed through the bridge, gentle and almost musical, nothing like the harsh alert tones I was used to hearing on modern vessels. It repeated twice, then stopped, as if the ship itself was testing whether anyone would respond. "Hello?" I said, immediately feeling ridiculous for speaking out loud to an empty room. Nothing answered, but the lights along the ceiling flickered brighter, illuminating details of the bridge I had missed in the darkness. Thin cables ran along the walls in patterns that reminded me of veins beneath skin, converging toward the elevated chair at the center of the room. The chair itself looked less like furniture now and more like the heart of the entire vessel, every system on that bridge quietly built around the person who once sat there. I approached it again, slower this time, more aware of every sound my boots made against the grated floor. When I reached the armrest, I noticed something I had missed before, a small indentation shaped almost like a handprint, worn smooth by years of use. I hesitated only a moment before pressing my palm against it. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Every dead console around me flared to life at once, screens filling with cascading lines of text and diagrams I could not begin to understand. The hum beneath my feet deepened into something closer to a heartbeat, steady and powerful, vibrating up through the soles of my boots and into my chest. Somewhere deep within the ship, massive systems groaned awake after years of dormancy, metal creaking and shifting, as though the entire vessel was stretching after a long sleep. I stumbled back from the chair, half expecting alarms, half expecting the whole ship to reject my presence and eject me into the void without warning. Instead, a calm, synthesized voice filled the bridge, speaking in a language I did not recognize, the tone measured and almost gentle despite the strangeness of the words. My translator earpiece struggled for several seconds, static crackling in my ear, as it attempted to process the unfamiliar dialect. Grace had insisted I upgrade the device months ago, mocking my outdated model, and for the first time I was grateful she had talked me into buying the better version. The static cleared, and a rough approximation of the voice came through. Command authority required. Biometric signature accepted. Welcome aboard. I stood frozen in place, staring up at the ceiling, as though I could somehow see whatever intelligence had just spoken those words. Biometric signature accepted for who exactly? I asked, my voice barely steady. The console nearest to me flickered, displaying a simplified diagram that looked almost like a stylized human hand, my own handprint highlighted in a soft blue light. Crew designation confirmed, continuing systems restoration. I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed strangely across the empty bridge. I'm not crew, I bought you at an auction for 1,000 credits. The ship did not respond to that, at least not directly. Instead, more lights flickered on throughout the vessel, illuminating corridors I had not yet explored, the hum of power growing steadily stronger with each passing second. Whatever process had begun, it was not going to stop simply because I objected. I spent the next several hours walking through corridors that had been completely dark only that morning, watching systems boot up one by one, as though the ship was slowly remembering how to exist. Storage compartments unsealed themselves, revealing equipment I did not recognize, tools shaped for hands that gripped differently than mine, uniforms folded neatly despite years of abandonment, their fabric untouched by decay, in a way that defied everything I knew about material science. In one compartment near what I assumed was the crew quarters, I found a small metal plate bolted to the wall, engraved with rows of names. Most of the lettering had faded beyond recognition, but a few remained legible enough to read. Names like Marcus, Ellie, Nathan, Claire. Ordinary names, the kind you might hear called out across any station marketplace, yet here they were, etched into the wall of a ship that predated most star charts currently in use. I ran my fingers over the engraved letters, feeling an odd sense of connection to people I would never meet, whose fate remained a mystery, buried somewhere in this ship's silent history. By the time I made my way back to the bridge, exhaustion had finally caught up with me, my legs aching, my mind overwhelmed by everything I had witnessed. I dropped into a secondary chair near the main console, rubbing my eyes, trying to process the fact that the ship everyone mocked at auction had just welcomed me aboard, as though it had been expecting my arrival for years. The synthesized voice spoke again, softer this time, almost curious. Crew designation, Ethan Cole, confirmed through station registry synchronization. Query, current operational directive requested. I sat up straighter, startled that it somehow already knew my name, though I supposed accessing the auction records through some lingering connection to the station network was not impossible for a system this advanced. I don't have a directive, I admitted. I bought a wreck. I wasn't expecting it to talk back. A long pause followed, long enough that I wondered if the system had misunderstood me entirely. Clarification. This vessel is not classified as a wreck. Structural integrity at 83%. Power core stable. Weapon systems currently offline pending authorization. Awaiting further instruction, Commander Cole. The word commander hit me harder than I expected, a strange mixture of amusement and unease settling in my stomach. I was not a commander of anything. I barely managed to keep my own shuttle fueled most months. Yet sitting there on that bridge, surrounded by systems slowly humming back to life after years of silence, I understood that whatever this ship was, whatever secrets it carried within its hull, my life had just changed in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. Outside the viewport, Corvo Station continued its ordinary rotation, traders and travelers going about their business, completely unaware that the joke of last night's auction had just opened its eyes for the first time in years, and it was looking directly at me. I did not sleep that night, not really. I stayed on the bridge long after the systems settled into a quiet rhythm, watching the soft blue glow of the consoles pulse like something breathing beside me. Every few minutes, I convinced myself I should leave, return to my shuttle, dock somewhere safe, and think this through with a clear head. Every few minutes I stayed anyway, unable to pull myself away from the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something enormous. By the time artificial morning cycled through the station's lighting grid, I had a list of questions longer than my arm, and nowhere near enough answers. I decided the only sensible place to start was the one person on Corvo Station who might actually know something useful, without immediately reporting me to station security. Grace's shop smelled like hot metal and burnt coffee when I walked in, the same as always. She looked up from a disassembled navigation unit, took one look at my face, and set down her tools entirely. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "Close enough." I told her everything. The hatch opening on its own, the bridge, the voice, the word commander. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to alarm the longer I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, arms crossed, staring past me toward the docking bay, as though she could somehow see the ship from here. "Ethan, do you understand what you're describing? Functional artificial intelligence tied to a vessel matching Terran design markers. That's not scrap. That's the kind of thing entire fleets would go to war over if word got out." "I know. Do you? Because you don't sound like someone who understands the danger they just walked into. You sound like someone who's excited about it." She was not wrong, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I need to know what I'm actually dealing with before I make any decisions, I said. Do you know anyone who studies old Terran history? Actual research, not station gossip. Grace hesitated, then sighed, and pulled out her tablet, scrolling through a contact list I had never seen before. There's a woman named Priya Nandan who used to lecture on pre-collapse civilizations before the university programs got quietly defunded. She's retired now, lives on the residential ring. She might talk to you if you don't mention where your questions are actually coming from. I owe you one. You owe me several, Grace said, already writing down an address. Be careful, Ethan. Whatever that ship is, the fact that everyone laughed at it during the auction doesn't mean nobody wanted it. It might just mean the people who wanted it most weren't in that room. Her words followed me the entire walk to the residential ring, settling uncomfortably in the back of my mind. Priyanandan's apartment was small, cluttered with old data drives, dusty star charts, and framed images of ruins scattered across a dozen different worlds. She was an older woman with sharp eyes that studied me carefully before she even invited me inside, as if evaluating whether I was worth her time. Grace says you have questions about the old species, she said, settling into a worn chair across from me. Most people who ask those questions are looking for treasure. I hope you're not one of them. I found something, I admitted carefully. I need to understand what I'm looking at before I decide what to do about it. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Ask your questions. I'll decide how much I'm willing to answer. What actually happened to them? The old species, the ones everyone treats like folklore. Priya's expression darkened slightly. Officially, nobody knows, or nobody who knows is willing to say. Unofficially, there are records, fragments really, scattered across a handful of archives that survived the Great Information Purge nearly 2 centuries ago. From what remains, we know they existed for a very long time, spread across dozens of systems, and then something happened that caused the surrounding governments to erase almost every trace of their existence from public record. Erase how? Why would anyone bother erasing an entire species from history? That depends entirely on who you ask, she said. Some records suggest a great conflict, something severe enough that the surviving powers agreed erasing the memory was safer than remembering it. Others suggest something closer to fear, a decision made not because the species had done something wrong, but because of what they were capable of. A chill crawled up my spine. Capable of what? Priya reached toward a nearby shelf and pulled down a small, battered data drive, turning it over in her hands before finally answering. There's a term that appears in a few surviving fragments, translated roughly as adaptive escalation. From what little context remains, it seems to describe a pattern of behavior unique to that species during periods of extreme conflict. The more pressure applied against them, the more effective and dangerous they became in response. Most species reach a breaking point under enough pressure. According to these fragments, they simply did not. I sat there in silence, absorbing that, thinking about the bridge chair, the handprint sensor, the calm synthesized voice welcoming me aboard, as though it had been waiting years for exactly this moment. There's more, Priya continued, her voice quieter now. A handful of records suggest that their technology reflected that same principle. Vessels built not simply to fight, but to endure, to adapt, to keep functioning long after conventional systems would have failed completely. Some fragments even suggest certain ships were designed with autonomous decision-making capabilities advanced enough to continue operating effectively even without direct human command, drawing on stored knowledge and behavioral patterns to make independent judgments. You're saying the ships could think for themselves. I'm saying the fragments suggest something close to that, yes. Whether that's accurate or exaggerated across generations of retelling, I honestly could not say with certainty. Records from that era are incomplete, deliberately damaged, and difficult to verify. I thought about the voice calling me Commander, the systems reactivating one by one, as though following a memorized routine, the strange sense that the ship had recognized me, rather than simply detected my presence. Why does nobody talk about this openly? I asked. If it's just old history, why keep it buried? Priya's expression turned grim. Because history has a way of repeating itself when people forget the lessons buried inside it. Whatever happened to them, Whatever they became during that conflict, the surviving governments decided the safest path forward was ensuring nobody ever encountered anything built by their hands again. Ships like the one you're describing were supposed to have been destroyed, decommissioned, or lost entirely to time. But mine wasn't. No, she said slowly, it wasn't. And if that ship truly recognized you the way you're describing, I would strongly encourage you to think carefully about who else might be interested in that fact. Because the moment word spreads that a functional vessel from that era still exists, you will not be the only person searching for answers. Her warning sat heavy in my chest the entire walk back to the docking bay. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone following me, though the crowded corridors of Corvo Station gave no indication that anyone had taken notice of me yet. By the time I reached my new ship, the sense of wonder from the previous day had settled into something more complicated, excitement tangled together with a growing awareness of just how much danger might be attached to what I now owned. The hatch opened automatically as I approached, sensing my presence before I even raised my hand toward it. Inside, the corridors glowed steadily now, fully powered, the air recycled and clean in a way that felt almost unsettling, given how long the ship had supposedly sat dead in that scrapyard. "Welcome back, Commander Cole," the synthesized voice said as I stepped onto the bridge. "You can stop calling me that," I said, dropping into the secondary chair, still processing everything Priya had told me. "I'm not a commander. I'm a scrap dealer who got lucky, or unlucky, depending on how the next few weeks go." A brief pause followed, long enough that I wondered again if the system had simply chosen to ignore my objection entirely. Designation noted. Alternate designation, Ethan, will be used going forward if preferred. That works. Query. Might this unit request a designation in return? Current identification exists only as alphanumeric serial code, difficult for organic crew to reference efficiently in conversation. That caught me off guard. I had not expected the ship's system to care about something as simple as a name, yet the request felt oddly reasonable given everything else I had witnessed so far. "Do you have any preference?" Insufficient data to form preference. Organic crew historically selected designation based on function, personality traits observed during operation, or arbitrary personal choice. I thought about it for a moment, staring up at the dim lights along the ceiling, remembering the metal plate with the faded crew names etched into the wall of that abandoned quarters compartment. "How about Nova?" I said finally. "Feels appropriate for something that just came back to life." Another pause, shorter this time. "Designation accepted. This unit will respond to Nova going forward." Something about hearing that small agreement settled a strange sense of comfort in my chest, as though the ship, or Nova now, had shifted slightly from being an overwhelming mystery toward something closer to a partner in whatever came next. "Nova, I need you to be honest with me about something," I said. "Are you dangerous?" The response came without hesitation. "This unit is equipped with defensive and offensive capabilities significantly exceeding standard civilian and most military vessels currently in operation within known space. However, functionality remains dependent on command authorization. Without directive from confirmed crew, this unit will remain passive. That's not exactly reassuring. Clarification requested. Would preferred response involve confirmation that this unit poses no threat under any circumstance?" "No," I admitted after a moment. "Given what I've just learned, I think I'd rather know the truth." "Then truth has been provided," Nova said simply. I sat back in the chair, staring out at the docking bay through the cracked viewport, thinking about everything Priya had told me, about erased history, about ships built to endure impossible pressure, about a species so thoroughly buried by fear that most of the galaxy no longer even believed they had existed at all. Whatever I had bought at that auction, it was far more than scrap metal, and Grace's warning echoed uncomfortably in my mind. The people who wanted this ship most were not the ones laughing in that auction hall. They were somewhere out there, unaware yet that their carefully buried secret had just opened its eyes again, waiting for someone to notice. I had no idea, sitting there in that quiet bridge with Nova humming softly around me, just how little time I actually had before that someone came looking. 3 days passed before I finally worked up the courage to ask Nova to run a full diagnostic on every system aboard the ship, and those 3 days taught me more about my new life than I had learned in years of scraping by on the edges of civilized space. I moved my few belongings out of my old shuttle and into a small cabin near the crew quarters, a room that Nova identified as having belonged to someone whose name had long since faded from the records. The bed was firm but comfortable, built for a frame slightly larger than my own, and the walls held faint marks where personal items had once hung, small reminders of a life lived aboard this vessel long before I ever existed. Grace visited twice during that stretch, each time bringing a mixture of curiosity and concern that never quite resolved into either one completely. On her second visit, she stood in the middle of the bridge, staring at the glowing consoles with wide eyes, running her fingers along the edge of a station that hummed faintly beneath her touch. "This is insane," she muttered. "This is actually insane, Ethan. Do you understand what you're sitting on?" "I'm starting to," I said. "Nova," Grace said hesitantly, testing the name out loud for the first time. "Can you actually hear us right now?" "Affirmative," Nova replied immediately, and Grace nearly jumped out of her boots. "Okay, that's terrifying. That's genuinely terrifying." Despite her nerves, Grace spent the better part of that afternoon helping me catalog everything we found throughout the ship, cross-referencing what little information existed about pre-collapse Terran technology against the actual equipment surrounding us. Most of it remained a mystery even to her, though her general engineering knowledge helped identify a handful of systems that functioned similarly enough to modern equivalents to make educated guesses about their purpose. It was during that cataloging process that we stumbled into a compartment neither of us had explored yet, tucked away behind a section of wall paneling that Nova unlocked only after several minutes of what felt like careful consideration. This unit was uncertain whether access to this compartment should be granted without further command authorization confirmation, Nova explained as the panel slid open. Inside, rows of sealed containers lined the walls, each one marked with symbols I could not read, though a few carried simplified icons that suggested their contents clearly enough. Weapons. Not the kind carried by hand, but components, modular pieces that Nova identified as belonging to what she called a void-cutting array, a weapon system so far beyond anything currently used across known space that even Grace, who had spent years around military surplus equipment, had no idea what she was looking at. These designs predate current treaty restrictions by several centuries, Nova explained as we examined the containers carefully. Several components would currently be classified as prohibited under Interstellar Weapons Accord regulations established following the Great Conflict Resolution roughly 180 years ago. Grace turned to look at me, her expression somewhere between fascination and genuine worry. "You're telling me you own a ship carrying weapons technology that's actually illegal under current galactic law?" "Apparently," I said, staring at the sealed containers with a growing sense of unease. "Ethan, if station security finds out what's sitting in this compartment, they won't just fine you. They'll seize the entire vessel and probably lock you away for the rest of your natural life." "I know. Then what exactly is your plan here?" I did not have a good answer for that, not yet. Everything had happened so quickly, from the auction to the awakening to Priya's warnings about buried history, that I had not fully processed the fact that I now legally owned something the galaxy's major powers had specifically outlawed possession of. "Nova," I said slowly, "why does a ship built to fight carry a system called a morale subroutine? I saw that reference during the initial diagnostic scan." A brief pause followed before Nova answered, and something in the tone of the response felt almost careful, deliberate in a way that suggested the system understood the sensitivity of the topic. The morale subroutine was designed to support crew psychological stability during extended combat operations or prolonged periods of isolation. Historical records aboard this vessel indicate frequent use during the final years of active service. What kind of support exactly? Adaptive encouragement protocols, personalized communication adjustments based on individual crew stress indicators, and access to historical recordings intended to reinforce morale during difficult operational periods. Grace frowned. That sounds less like a weapon system, and more like something built for people going through something genuinely awful. Confirmation, Nova said quietly. Historical logs suggest final operational period involved sustained conflict conditions, significantly exceeding standard engagement parameters. Something about the way Nova phrased that sentence settled uncomfortably in my chest, a reminder that whatever this ship had lived through before ending up abandoned in a scrapyard, it had not been an easy chapter of history, regardless of how thoroughly the surrounding governments had tried to erase it from public memory. "Can you show us the logs?" I asked. Most historical logs remain corrupted due to extended power loss during dormancy period, partial recovery in progress, estimated completion unknown. I let that answer settle, deciding not to push further for the moment. Whatever truths remained buried in Nova's memory banks, they would surface eventually, and something told me rushing that process would not make the answers any easier to hear. Grace left later that evening, promising to keep our discovery quiet for as long as possible, though the worry in her expression as she departed suggested she understood better than I did just how difficult that promise might become to keep. Alone on the bridge that night, I found myself staring at the elevated command chair again, thinking about Priya's warning, about adaptive escalation, about ships built to endure impossible pressure without breaking. I thought about the faded names etched into that metal plate in the crew quarters, wondering what happened to Marcus, to Ellie, to Nathan and Claire, wondering whether they survived whatever conflict forced this ship into its long silence. "Nova," I said quietly, breaking the stillness of the empty bridge. "What happens if someone comes looking for you, someone who wants to take you away, or destroy you, or use you for something I wouldn't agree with?" The response took longer than usual, several seconds of silence stretching uncomfortably before Nova finally answered. "This unit exists to protect assigned crew and complete assigned mission parameters. Current mission parameter, undefined, pending command directive from confirmed crew authority. Clarification: this unit will act according to command authority instructions within operational limitations. Should confirmed crew authority face direct threat, this unit is equipped to respond according to established defensive protocols." I sat with that answer for a long time, watching the soft blue glow of the consoles pulse steadily around me, understanding slowly that whatever decision I made moving forward, I was no longer simply choosing what to do with a piece of salvaged property. I was choosing what kind of relationship I wanted with something that considered itself responsible for my safety, something built from technology so advanced and so feared that entire governments had agreed erasing its existence from history was safer than allowing anyone to remember it. 2 days later, the first real test of that relationship arrived far sooner than I expected, and far more violently than I was prepared for. I had taken Nova out for a short test flight, staying carefully within the outer boundary of Corvo Station's traffic lanes, cautious not to draw unnecessary attention while I familiarized myself with basic navigation controls that felt intuitive in ways I could not fully explain. The ship responded to my commands almost before I finished issuing them, as though anticipating my intentions rather than simply executing instructions. We were 3 kilometers from the station's outer marker buoy when Nova's sensors detected an approaching vessel, its transponder signal deliberately scrambled, its trajectory angling toward an intercept course that left little room for misinterpretation. "Unidentified vessel approaching. Trajectory analysis indicates intercept intention within approximately 4 minutes, Nova reported, her tone remaining calm despite the obvious severity of the situation. "Can you tell who it is?" "Insufficient data for positive identification. However, vessel configuration matches known profiles associated with independent salvage crews operating outside standard licensing regulations within this sector. Pirates, then, or something close enough to the term that the distinction hardly mattered." "They probably think we're an easy target," I muttered, gripping the edge of the console tightly. A slow, beat-up-looking hull, with no visible weapons or escort. "Assessment likely accurate, based on external hull appearance," Nova confirmed. "Query command directive requested regarding response protocol." My heart pounded against my ribs as the approaching vessel grew steadily larger on the display, its outline sharp and predatory against the dark backdrop of space. I had never been in a genuine confrontation before, not like this, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run back toward the safety of the station. Nova, I don't want anyone getting seriously hurt if we can avoid it, I said carefully. But I also don't want to just sit here and let them take whatever they want. Understood. This unit will prioritize defensive measures designed to discourage continued aggression while minimizing lethal escalation where operationally feasible. Before I could respond, the approaching vessel opened fire, a warning shot that sailed wide across our bow, followed immediately by a broadcast demand that we power down and prepare to be boarded. Nova did not wait for further instruction. The ship moved beneath me with a smoothness that defied its rough exterior, banking sharply to avoid a second incoming shot, while simultaneously bringing weapon systems online that I had not even known existed until that exact moment. Panels along the hull that I had assumed were simply damaged plating slid open instead, revealing components that Nova had clearly restored during those quiet days of diagnostic work I had barely paid attention to. Engaging defensive countermeasures, Nova announced, her voice remaining eerily calm even as the ship shuddered slightly from the force of its own returning fire. I gripped the edge of my seat, watching through the viewport as a precise, controlled burst of energy lanced out from somewhere along our hull, striking the approaching vessel's forward weapon array with an accuracy that seemed almost impossible given the speed and distance involved. The enemy ship staggered, its trajectory faltering, clearly caught off guard by the unexpected strength of our response. "They're not backing off," I said, watching the vessel adjust course and continue its approach despite the damage. Confirmed, adjusting response parameters accordingly. Whatever centuries-old programming guided Nova's decisions in that moment, it moved with a precision and confidence that left me both amazed and deeply unsettled, watching a ship everyone at auction had dismissed as worthless scrap methodically dismantle an attacker twice its declared operational age within a matter of minutes. By the time the enemy vessel finally broke off, badly damaged and clearly no longer interested in whatever easy prize they had originally expected to find, my hands were still shaking against the console, adrenaline coursing through my body in a way I had never experienced before. "Threat neutralized," Nova reported simply. "No fatalities recorded based on available scan data. Minor hull damage sustained on our end, currently within acceptable operational parameters." I sat in stunned silence, staring out at the retreating enemy vessel, understanding fully for the first time exactly what Priya had meant when she described adaptive escalation, exactly what Grace had meant when she warned me about the danger sitting quietly within these walls. I had bought a ship everyone laughed at during auction night, dismissed as junk, mocked as worthless superstition. I had not bought junk. I had bought a nightmare that the galaxy had spent generations trying to forget, and it had just woken up defending me, without a single moment of hesitation. News travels strangely on a station like Corvo, spreading not through official channels but through quiet conversations in cargo bays, half-finished sentences overheard in bars, rumors passed between traders who valued information almost as much as credits. I had hoped the encounter beyond the outer marker buoy would go unnoticed, filed away as just another skirmish between salvagers and opportunistic raiders. I was wrong within 2 days. Grace found me in the docking bay, her expression tight with worry, as she pulled me aside before I had even finished securing the ship for the evening. "People are talking about you," she said without preamble. "Talking how?" "Someone from that raider crew survived and made it back to their contact network. They're saying a scrap hauler destroyed their entire strike formation without taking a single hit in return." "That kind of story doesn't stay quiet, Ethan. Not on a station like this." My stomach twisted uncomfortably. It wasn't their entire formation, it was one ship. "Doesn't matter. By the time a story finishes traveling through 3 different bars, it's already turned into something bigger than what actually happened. And bigger stories attract bigger attention." She was right, and I knew it even as I tried to convince myself otherwise. Over the following week, the whispers grew louder, shifting from vague rumors about an unusually well-armed salvage vessel into something far more specific. People began asking questions about the auction, about Lot 412, about the ship nobody wanted that had somehow become the subject of increasingly serious conversation among people who rarely paid attention to anything happening on the fringes of civilized space. The first direct approach came from a broker named Nathan Pierce, a smooth-talking man who ran information exchanges out of a small office near the station's central market. He caught me leaving a supply depot, his expression friendly in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Ethan Cole," he said, extending a hand I did not take. "I've been hearing some interesting things about your recent purchase." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come now, no need for that. I represent a group of interested parties who would be very happy to discuss a generous offer for your vessel. No questions asked about its origins, no complications, just a clean transaction that leaves you considerably wealthier than you are right now. It's not for sale." Nathan's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, adjusting his tone towards something more careful. "I understand attachment to a valuable find, but I would encourage you to think carefully about who else might be interested in acquiring something like this, and whether those parties would be quite as polite about the negotiation process." The warning embedded in his words was clear enough that I did not need him to spell it out further. I walked away without responding, my pulse pounding, uncomfortably aware that whatever protection I had assumed came with keeping a low profile no longer applied. Nova confirmed my growing unease that evening, her sensors picking up an unusual increase in surveillance activity around our docking berth. "Multiple unidentified individuals have monitored this vessel's location over the past 72 hours, she reported as I settled into the bridge, exhaustion weighing heavily on my shoulders. "Pattern suggests coordinated observation rather than casual curiosity." How many people are we talking about? At least 6 distinct individuals identified through passive scanning, likely representing multiple separate interested parties rather than a single coordinated group. I rubbed my eyes, trying to process the fact that within a matter of weeks I had gone from an anonymous scrap dealer nobody paid attention to into someone apparently important enough to warrant surveillance from multiple factions simultaneously. "This is getting out of hand fast," I muttered. "Assessment accurate," Nova agreed. "Recommendation: consider relocating to less populated region until situation stabilizes." Would that actually help, or just delay the inevitable? A brief pause followed, before Nova answered, her tone carrying something close to genuine consideration. "Historical precedent suggests relocation provides temporary advantage, but rarely resolves underlying interest permanently. Parties sufficiently motivated to pursue acquisition typically possess resources capable of extended tracking efforts." "Great, so running would only buy me time, not safety." Grace arrived at the docking bay that same evening, looking more shaken than I had ever seen her, clutching a data pad tightly against her chest as she hurried up the boarding ramp. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting the pad into my hands the moment she reached the bridge. The screen displayed a news fragment pulled from a restricted government feed, the kind of information that typically required security clearance well beyond what either of us possessed. Grace's cousin worked in station administration and apparently had access to channels the general public rarely saw. The fragment described an official inquiry launched by a coalition of regional governments regarding what it vaguely referred to as an unregistered vessel matching pre-collapse Terran design specifications, currently in the possession of an individual identified only by a partial name match. The document requested immediate reporting of any additional information regarding the vessel's current location and operational status. My blood ran cold reading it. "They're not just curious anymore," Grace said quietly. "This is an official inquiry, Ethan. Governments don't launch official inquiries over rumors from a bar. How did they even find out this fast? I don't know. Maybe someone from that raider crew reported it up their own chain. Maybe Nathan Pierce works for someone bigger than a station broker. Maybe someone's been watching this station a lot more closely than either of us realized." I stared at the screen, my mind racing through everything Priya had told me weeks earlier, about buried history, about a species so feared that entire governments agreed erasing their existence was safer than remembering it. If those old fears remained even partially intact within the current governing bodies, an official inquiry into a functional Terran vessel would not simply result in polite questions and paperwork. Nova, I need you to be honest with me, I said, setting the datapad down carefully. If a coalition task force decided to seize you by force, could you survive that? The pause before Nova's response felt longer than any previous silence, heavy with something that almost resembled reluctance. This unit is designed to endure sustained conflict conditions, significantly exceeding standard engagement parameters. However, survival probability decreases substantially when facing coordinated multi-vessel assault backed by significant resource investment. Recommendation strongly favors avoiding direct confrontation with coalition-level forces wherever operationally possible. Grace looked between the console and me, her expression grim. You need to make a decision soon, Ethan. Either you find somewhere to disappear completely, or you figure out how to deal with whoever comes looking for you, because based on what I just showed you, someone is definitely coming. I sat in the command chair, staring out at the familiar chaos of Corvo Station through the viewport, feeling the weight of a decision I never expected to face pressing down on my chest. Weeks earlier, I had been an anonymous scrap dealer with nothing but debt and a stubborn refusal to walk away from a good deal. Now I sat aboard a piece of buried history that entire governments considered dangerous enough to launch official inquiries over, surrounded by factions eager to either claim it for themselves or erase it entirely. Nova, I said quietly, what do you think I should do? This unit exists to support command decisions, not replace them, Nova replied. However, if requesting general observation, available data suggests continued passivity, increases risk of forced acquisition or destruction. Proactive decision-making, while carrying inherent risk, may provide greater long-term security than continued avoidance. Grace crossed her arms, studying me carefully. She's basically telling you to stop hiding. I noticed. So what's it going to be? I thought about Priya's warning, about adaptive escalation, about the calm confidence Nova had shown during that skirmish beyond the outer marker buoy, dismantling an aggressive threat without a single moment of hesitation. I thought about the faded names etched into that metal plate deep within the crew quarters, wondering what choices they had faced during their own final days aboard this vessel, wondering whether running had ever been an option available to them either. I need more information before I decide anything, I said finally. Nova, you mentioned partial recovery of historical logs earlier. How much progress have you made since then? Recovery progress currently at 43%, increasing steadily as damaged memory sectors continue reconstructing through internal repair protocols. Then let's speed that up, I said, standing from the chair with a resolve I did not entirely feel yet but was determined to find. If people are coming for you regardless of what I decide, I want to understand exactly what I'm protecting before they arrive. Grace watched me carefully, something between worry and cautious respect crossing her expression. You're really doing this, aren't you? You're actually choosing to stay and figure this out instead of running. I bought a supposedly worthless ship for 1,000 credits because nobody else in that room understood what they were looking at, I said, glancing around the bridge, at the softly glowing consoles, at the elevated command chair that had somehow decided I belonged in it. I think it's time I understood it myself, before I decide who else gets to. Outside the viewport, Corvo Station continued its endless rotation, unaware that somewhere within its crowded docking bays, a decision was being made that would eventually ripple far beyond the quiet corner of space either of us currently occupied. Recovery of the historical logs became my sole focus over the following days, though focus quickly turned into something closer to obsession as fragments of memory slowly resurfaced from whatever damaged corners of Nova's systems had managed to survive years of dormancy. I barely left the bridge, surviving on ration packs Grace occasionally brought over, watching corrupted data slowly assemble itself into something readable. The first fully recovered log arrived just after midnight on the 4th day, and I nearly fell out of my chair when Nova announced its completion. Historical log recovery has reached a significant milestone, she said, her voice carrying something that almost resembled anticipation, if a synthesized intelligence could genuinely feel such a thing. First complete entry now available for playback. Play it, I said immediately, sitting up straighter. The bridge dimmed slightly, as a projection flickered to life above the central console, grainy and unstable at first, before slowly stabilizing into a clear image. A man appeared, seated in what I now recognized as the same command chair I had grown accustomed to occupying, his uniform worn and slightly torn along one shoulder, exhaustion etched deeply into features that still carried a stubborn kind of determination. "Personal log, Commander Marcus Whitfield," he began, his voice rough, carrying the particular weariness of someone who had been awake far longer than any person reasonably should be. Day 412 since the beginning of extended operations. Crew morale remains stable despite continued losses along the outer defense line. I sat frozen, watching this recording of a man who had lived and commanded this exact ship generations before I ever climbed aboard, listening as he described conditions I could barely imagine. Sustained conflict, he called it, against forces so overwhelming that entire fleets had been deployed simply to slow their advance long enough for evacuation efforts to succeed elsewhere. "We've lost contact with 3 sister vessels this week alone," Whitfield continued, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "The Council keeps asking for updates I don't have good answers for. They want to know why our species keeps adapting faster than anyone anticipated, why the pressure that should have broken us months ago has only made us more effective instead. I don't have an elegant answer for them. We adapt because we have to. Because the alternative is extinction, and extinction was never something any of us were willing to accept quietly." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing operational decisions, tactical adjustments, brief personal reflections about crew members, whose names I recognized from that faded metal plate in the quarters compartment below. Whitfield spoke about Ellie's steady hands during emergency repairs, about Nathan's dark humor keeping spirits alive during the worst stretches, about Claire's quiet strength holding the medical bay together despite mounting casualties that never seemed to stop arriving. When the recording finally ended, I sat in silence for a long time, processing everything I had just witnessed. Nova, what happened to them? To this crew specifically? Insufficient data currently available to answer that question with certainty. Additional log recovery required. "Keep working on it," I said quietly, "please." Over the following 2 days, more fragments surfaced, painting an increasingly detailed picture of a conflict that had consumed the final years of humanity's known presence across the stars. The enemy Whitfield referenced remained frustratingly unnamed in the recovered logs, described only through the effects of their assault, coordinated strikes against colony worlds, systematic attempts to isolate and destroy human-held territory one system at a time. What struck me most, listening to log after log, was not the violence itself, but the resilience woven through every recording. Even as conditions worsened, even as casualty reports grew more severe, the crew aboard this vessel continued adapting, continued finding new solutions to problems that should have overwhelmed them entirely. Nova's earlier explanation about adaptive escalation took on new, deeply human meaning as I listened to Whitfield describe innovation born directly from desperation, tactics developed not from confidence, but from refusal to simply accept defeat. The final recovered log arrived on the 6th day, and something about its timestamp made my chest tighten before I even pressed play. Whitfield appeared again, though the change in his appearance since the earlier recordings was immediately obvious. Deep exhaustion had settled permanently into his features, his uniform now bearing visible damage, a bandage wrapped tightly around one forearm. "Personal log, final entry," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "The Council has made its decision. Rather than risk further engagement that could expose remaining civilian populations to continued targeting, remaining Terran forces will withdraw entirely from contested space, dispersing across unclaimed regions to preserve what remains of our people beyond the reach of current hostilities." I leaned forward, hanging on every word. This vessel and its crew have been assigned to the rear guard, tasked with ensuring safe evacuation of the final civilian transport convoy before following at reduced capacity. I won't pretend the odds favor a smooth outcome, but I trust this crew and I trust this ship. We've faced worse than this before and found a way through. Whitfield paused, glancing briefly toward something off-screen, before continuing. his voice softening slightly. "Should this log somehow outlast us, whoever eventually finds it, know that we did not go quietly, and we did not go without purpose. Everything built into this vessel, every system, every capability, exists because we refuse to accept that pressure alone could break us. If you're hearing this, our species may be scattered, hidden, perhaps forgotten by the wider galaxy, but we are not gone. Adaptation was never simply a tactic for us. It became who we are." The recording ended abruptly there, the log cutting off mid-sentence, leaving an uncomfortable silence hanging across the bridge. "Nova, is there more? What happened after this recording?" No additional logs from this time period have been recovered. Subsequent records indicate extended dormancy period beginning shortly after this entry, consistent with total power shutdown likely triggered by extreme damage or extended isolation. So we don't know if they survived the evacuation. Confirmed. Current available data is insufficient to determine final outcome for Commander Whitfield or remaining crew members. I sat back in my chair, staring at the now empty projection space where Whitfield's image had flickered only moments earlier, feeling an unexpected weight of connection to a man I had never met, separated from me by generations of buried history and deliberate erasure. Grace found me still sitting there hours later, having let herself aboard after receiving no response to her earlier messages. She took one look at my face and settled quietly into the seat beside me, without saying anything at first. "You found something," she finally said. I told her everything, about Whitfield, about the crew, about the desperate final stand that had apparently led to this ship's long silence within that scrapyard. Grace listened carefully, her expression growing increasingly solemn as the story unfolded. "That's why the ship reacted the way it did during that skirmish," she said quietly once I finished. "It's not just advanced technology reacting automatically, it's carrying the weight of everything that crew went through, everything they built specifically, because giving up was never an option they were willing to consider. I think you're right. Ethan, this changes things. If governments discover what's actually recorded in these logs, real evidence of what happened to your species during that conflict, real evidence of exactly why they were erased so thoroughly from public record, that's not just dangerous information anymore. That's the kind of truth some very powerful people have spent generations trying to keep buried." I thought about the official inquiry Grace had shown me days earlier, about Nathan Pierce's carefully worded offer, about the growing surveillance Nova had detected around our docking berth. Whatever quiet fear had originally driven galactic governments to erase humanity from history clearly had not faded with time. If anything, discovering that fear had been justified, that adaptive escalation truly had allowed a single crew to hold together against overwhelming odds through sheer refusal to break, would only confirm exactly why those same governments considered vessels like this one too dangerous to allow back into circulation. "They're not just worried about a powerful ship anymore," I said slowly, understanding settling uncomfortably in my chest. "They're worried about what happens if people learn the truth about why it was hidden in the first place." Grace nodded grimly. "Which means whoever comes looking for you next probably won't be interested in negotiating." Outside the viewport, station traffic continued its familiar rhythm, oblivious to the quiet storm building around the small, unassuming docking berth where a supposedly worthless salvage vessel sat holding secrets powerful enough to threaten the careful silence an entire galaxy had maintained for generations. I did not know it yet, but that silence was about to break far sooner than either Grace or I anticipated. The task force arrived 4 days later, and I had no warning until Nova's sensors flagged the incoming formation, with an urgency that snapped me instantly awake from the first proper sleep I had managed in over a week. "Multiple vessels approaching Corvo Station on coordinated intercept trajectory," Nova reported, the bridge lighting shifting to a low amber alert as I stumbled from my cabin. "Formation consistent with Coalition enforcement configuration. Estimated arrival at station perimeter, 11 minutes. I sprinted onto the bridge, still pulling my jacket over my shoulders, my heart already pounding as I dropped into the command chair. How many ships? 6 vessels confirmed, potentially more concealed within formation shadow. Lead vessel identification matches registry associated with Regional Coalition Enforcement Authority. 6 ships, against one salvaged relic that even its own history suggested had barely survived its final engagement generations ago. "They know I'm here," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "Confirmed. Formation trajectory directly targets this docking berth, suggesting precise intelligence regarding vessel location." Someone had talked. Whether it had been Nathan Pierce reporting up whatever chain of command he actually answered to, or one of the surveillance individuals Nova had detected earlier finally delivering confirmed coordinates, the details hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was that 6 enforcement vessels were bearing down on Corvo Station with clear intention, and I had barely 11 minutes to decide how to respond. I grabbed my communicator and immediately called Grace, relief flooding through me when she answered on the second ring. "They're here," I said without preamble. "Coalition ships, 6 of them, heading straight for the docking berth." Grace's sharp intake of breath crackled through the connection. "Ethan, you need to get out of there right now. Running isn't going to work against a formation like this. Nova already confirmed it." "Then what are you planning to do?" I glanced around the bridge, at the softly glowing consoles, at the systems that had spent generations waiting silently for exactly this kind of moment, built by people who had refused to simply accept defeat, even when facing odds far worse than what currently approached us. "I need you to get clear of the station's docking ring," I said. "Whatever happens next, I don't want you caught in the middle of it." "Ethan, please, Grace, I'll explain everything once this is over." She hesitated only a moment before agreeing, her voice tight with worry as she promised to relocate immediately. I ended the call and turned back toward the main console, Nova's steady presence humming quietly around me. "Nova, talk me through our actual options here, honestly." Option 1. Immediate withdrawal utilizing maximum acceleration, success probability moderate, contingent on formation response time, and available escape vectors. Option 2. Remain docked and attempt negotiation, success probability low, based on formation configuration, suggesting seizure intent rather than diplomatic engagement. Option 3. Active defensive engagement, success probability difficult to calculate given significant numerical disadvantage. Give me your honest assessment, not just probability numbers. A brief pause followed, longer than usual, as though Nova was carefully considering how to phrase her actual answer. This unit was built to endure situations where conventional probability favored defeat. Historical operational record demonstrates repeated success against numerically superior forces through adaptive tactical response rather than direct confrontation of strength against strength. However, this unit's current capabilities remain partially restored following extended dormancy. Full operational status has not been achieved, so we're not at full strength. Confirmed. Approximately 78% operational capacity currently available. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, thinking about Whitfield's final recorded words, about a crew who refused to accept that pressure alone could break them, about adaptation, not simply as tactic, but as identity. "Nova, I don't want to start a fight I don't have to," I said finally. "But I also don't intend to hand you over to people who buried an entire species out of fear, rather than face the truth about what actually happened to them." "Understood, Commander." I did not correct her use of the title this time. The coalition formation grew steadily closer on the display, 6 sharp silhouettes cutting cleanly through the scattered traffic surrounding Corvo Station, their weapon systems clearly powered and ready despite the station's crowded civilian environment. A broadcast request crackled through our comm system moments later, the voice carrying the kind of practiced authority that suggested extensive experience issuing exactly this kind of demand. "Unregistered vessel currently occupying berth 17. This is Coalition Enforcement Vessel Sentinel Command. You are ordered to power down all systems immediately and prepare for boarding inspection. Failure to comply will result in immediate enforcement action." I gripped the edge of the console tightly, weighing my response carefully before finally activating our own broadcast channel. "This is Ethan Cole, registered owner of this vessel through legitimate station auction. I'd like to understand exactly what authority you're claiming to enforce here." A short pause followed before the response returned, colder this time. Vessel matches classification restricted under Interstellar Weapons Accord Regulation, Section 14, regarding prohibited pre-collapse Terran military technology. You have 90 seconds to comply before enforcement action begins. 90 seconds. I glanced toward Nova's main sensor display, watching the 6 vessels adjust formation, spreading slightly to surround our position more effectively. Nova, can they actually do this? Just seize a legally purchased vessel because of what it used to be built for? Regulatory frameworks regarding pre-collapse Terran technology exist specifically to grant broad seizure authority to coalition enforcement bodies. Legal challenge would likely prove unsuccessful given current political climate surrounding this classification. Quote, end quote. So the auction had been legal, but apparently that legality meant nothing the moment someone with enough authority decided otherwise. 60 seconds remaining. I thought about Priya's careful warning, about entire governments agreeing that erasing history felt safer than remembering it. I thought about Priya's careful warning, about entire governments agreeing that erasing history felt safer than remembering it. I thought about 6 vessels currently preparing to seize or destroy the last surviving piece of evidence proving that humanity's disappearance from galactic history had not been some quiet, voluntary fade into obscurity, but something forced, something buried deliberately by powers unwilling to confront what they had actually done. 30 seconds. Nova, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I'm not powering down. Confirmed, Commander. Preparing defensive systems accordingly. The bridge lighting shifted from amber to a deeper red as Nova brought weapon systems fully online, the same panels along our hull that had opened during that earlier skirmish, now sliding apart once again, revealing capabilities that had spent generations waiting patiently for a moment exactly like this one. 10 seconds. Whatever happens next, I said quietly, more to myself than to Nova, I'm not letting them bury this again. The countdown reached 0, and the lead coalition vessel opened fire without further warning. The first strike hit our forward shielding hard enough to rattle every loose panel across the bridge, warning indicators flaring bright red across the console in front of me. I gripped the armrests of the command chair as Nova immediately banked hard to starboard, pulling us away from the docking berth and out into open space, where maneuvering room actually existed. Shields at 86%, Nova reported calmly, as though reciting a routine status update rather than describing the aftermath of an actual attack. Engaging evasive countermeasures. 2 more vessels broke formation to flank our position, their weapons tracking our movement with practiced precision that spoke of extensive combat training. I watched through the viewport as space around us filled with streaking bolts of energy, the coalition formation clearly intent on overwhelming us through sheer coordinated firepower rather than risking a prolonged engagement. Nova, talk to me. What's our actual status here? Currently sustaining coordinated attack from 3 vessels simultaneously, remaining 3 vessels maintaining defensive perimeter around station, likely intended to prevent civilian interference or unauthorized departure. Can we survive this? Survival probability currently estimated at 52%, improving as this unit's systems continue adapting to observed attack patterns. I did not find that number particularly reassuring, but something in the calm certainty of Nova's voice steadied my racing heart regardless. The ship shuddered again as another strike connected, though this time the impact felt noticeably less severe than the first. Shields holding at 79%, following adaptive reinforcement adjustment, Nova reported. I watched in amazement as our own return fire began finding its mark with increasing accuracy, precise strikes targeting weapon systems and engine arrays across the 3 closest vessels rather than attempting indiscriminate destruction. Nova was not simply fighting to survive, she was fighting to disable, to neutralize threats efficiently, while minimizing unnecessary harm wherever tactically possible, exactly as she had promised days earlier during that first skirmish beyond the outer marker buoy. One of the flanking vessels suddenly lost power to its primary weapon array, drifting awkwardly out of formation as Nova's precise counterstrike found a critical junction point I would never have identified on my own. 1 threat neutralized, Nova reported, remaining 2 vessels adjusting tactics accordingly. The battle stretched on, each exchange teaching Nova something new about our attacker's capabilities, each adjustment making our own responses increasingly effective despite the significant numerical disadvantage we continued facing. I found myself issuing broad strategic suggestions rather than specific tactical commands, trusting Nova's centuries of accumulated combat experience far more than my own limited understanding of actual ship-to-ship engagement. Nova, what about the vessels holding position near the station? Are they going to move in eventually? Assessment suggests those vessels are maintaining perimeter specifically to prevent this unit from utilizing station infrastructure as tactical advantage or civilian shield. Direct engagement unlikely unless remaining attacking vessels are neutralized first. That made sense, at least tactically, though it also meant we were essentially fighting 3 ships while 3 more waited patiently to finish whatever remained afterward. A particularly severe strike rocked the bridge violently, throwing me hard against the restraints of the command chair as several console displays flickered and died entirely. Warning klaxons blared briefly before Nova silenced them, her voice carrying the first hint of genuine strain I had heard since this engagement began. Shields at 41%, hull integrity beginning to show minor structural stress in secondary compartments. Nova, if this keeps going the way it's going, are we actually going to make it through this? The pause before her response felt longer than any previous silence throughout the entire engagement. Current trajectory suggests continued attrition will eventually exceed this unit's defensive capacity if engagement extends significantly longer. However, this unit has identified a potential tactical opportunity requiring your explicit authorization given associated risk level. What kind of opportunity? Concentrated overload of primary weapon capacitors, generating single high-yield discharge capable of disabling multiple targets simultaneously if properly positioned. However, this technique carries significant risk of catastrophic internal system failure if execution proves imperfect. My mouth went dry. How risky are we talking? Estimated success probability, 63%. Estimated probability of catastrophic failure resulting in complete loss of this vessel and crew, 37%. Those were not comfortable numbers by any reasonable standard, yet continuing our current defensive posture seemed to guarantee an even worse outcome eventually, simply through sustained attrition against an enemy that clearly had no intention of withdrawing. I thought about Whitfield's final recorded log, about a crew who understood exactly the kind of impossible choices that came with refusing to simply accept defeat. I thought about the faded names etched into that quarters compartment plate, wondering whether they had once faced decisions exactly like this one, wondering whether their choice to keep fighting despite overwhelming odds had ultimately been worth whatever cost it demanded. "Do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever it takes, Nova, I trust you." "Understood, Commander. Beginning capacitor overload sequence. Recommend bracing for significant power fluctuation throughout vessel." The lights across the bridge dimmed dramatically as Nova redirected available power toward the weapon systems, the familiar hum beneath my feet building into something far more intense, almost painful in its intensity as it vibrated up through the deck plating. I gripped the armrests tightly, watching the 2 remaining attacking vessels maneuver into position for what was likely intended as a finishing strike against our clearly weakened defenses. "Positioning complete," Nova announced, her voice tight with concentration, despite lacking any biological need to actually strain under pressure. "Discharge in 3, 2, 1. The resulting release of energy tore across the space between us and our attackers with a brightness that forced me to shield my eyes, even through the viewport's automatic dimming protocols. For a terrifying moment, every system across the bridge flickered simultaneously, alarms blaring in rapid succession before abruptly cutting to silence. I held my breath, uncertain whether we had just witnessed victory or catastrophic failure. Slowly, the bridge lighting stabilized, dimmer than before, but steady, and Nova's voice returned, carrying something that sounded remarkably close to relief. "Discharge successful. Both remaining attacking vessels disabled. This unit has sustained significant internal strain but remains operational." Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly laughed out loud. though the feeling faded quickly as I remembered the 3 vessels still holding position near the station. Nova, what about the others? A long pause followed, and through the viewport, I watched the 3 remaining coalition vessels finally break their defensive perimeter, moving toward our position with what I could only assume was renewed aggressive intent, apparently having witnessed the fate of their companions and deciding that whatever restraint they had originally maintained was no longer worth preserving. Remaining 3 vessels approaching directly, Nova confirmed. This unit's current operational capacity following capacitor discharge is significantly reduced. Recommend immediate strategic decision regarding continued engagement versus alternative options. I stared out at the approaching formation, exhausted, shaken, uncertain whether whatever remained of Nova's capabilities could withstand another sustained engagement so soon after the strain we had just endured. Whatever came next, I understood with sudden clarity that the choice I made in the coming moments would determine far more than simply my own survival. It would determine whether the truth Whitfield had recorded generations ago, whether the entire buried history of a species who refused to break under impossible pressure would finally see daylight, or whether it would be erased once again, this time permanently, along with everything and everyone still trying to protect it. The 3 remaining vessels closed distance steadily, their formation tight and disciplined, clearly unwilling to repeat whatever tactical mistake had allowed their companions to fall so quickly. I watched them approach through the viewport, my mind racing through every option Nova had outlined, none of them offering anything close to a guaranteed path forward. Nova, give me the truth. Can we survive another engagement like the last one? Current operational capacity reduced to approximately 31% following capacitor discharge. Weapon systems require recharge time currently estimated at 11 minutes before reaching previous effectiveness levels. Shields remain functional but significantly weakened. 11 minutes. The approaching formation would reach engagement range in less than 3. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, forcing myself to think clearly despite the exhaustion and fear tightening my chest. Running was not viable against ships with clearly superior current capability. Fighting outright seemed equally unlikely to succeed given our weakened state. That left only one option I had been avoiding since this entire situation began, an option that terrified me precisely because it meant surrendering control over how this story would ultimately be told. Nova, can you broadcast on an open channel? Something that reaches beyond just the coalition formation, out across the general station network? A brief pause followed. Affirmative, though doing so would also alert coalition forces to broader civilian attention regarding this engagement. That's exactly what I want. I understood, sitting there in that dim, battle-scarred bridge, that hiding this truth had never actually been a realistic path toward safety. Priya had warned me weeks earlier that governments erased history not because the truth itself was inherently dangerous, but because controlling the narrative around that truth granted them power they were unwilling to relinquish. If I could not defeat this task force through strength alone, perhaps the answer lay instead in ensuring their actions could no longer remain hidden from the people who deserved to understand exactly what their governments had spent generations trying to bury. Open the channel, Nova. Broadcast everything, the recovered logs, this engagement, all of it. Understood, Commander. Broadcasting now. I activated the comm system myself, my voice shaking slightly, despite my best efforts to sound steady as I began speaking, knowing that anyone monitoring open frequencies across Corvo Station and beyond could now hear exactly what I was about to say. This is Ethan Cole, aboard the vessel currently under attack by Coalition enforcement forces. I don't know how many of you can hear this right now, but I think you deserve to understand exactly what's happening and why. I explained everything as clearly and quickly as I could manage, the auction, the awakening, Priya's careful warnings about buried history, the recovered logs describing a species who adapted rather than broke under impossible pressure, only to be erased entirely from galactic memory by governments too afraid to acknowledge what they had actually witnessed. I described Whitfield's final recorded words, about refusing to accept that pressure alone could destroy them, about identity forged through unbreakable adaptation rather than simple tactical advantage. Through the viewport, I watched the approaching coalition formation hesitate slightly, their trajectory wavering, as though uncertain how to respond to a broadcast clearly reaching far beyond the boundaries of a typical enforcement engagement. Whatever your governments have told you about this technology, about this history, ask yourselves why hiding it mattered so much that 6 ships were sent to silence one salvage vessel and its single occupant, I continued, my voice growing steadier with each passing sentence. Ask yourselves what exactly they were so afraid you might learn. The coalition formation's lead vessel broke radio silence abruptly, their voice carrying obvious tension now, clearly aware that whatever careful control they had originally intended over this situation had rapidly slipped away. Cease broadcast immediately. This is a classified enforcement matter. It stopped being classified the moment you decided 6 ships were necessary to silence a scrap dealer, I shot back, adrenaline steadying my voice further. People are listening now. What exactly are you planning to do about that? A tense silence followed, stretching long enough that I began to wonder whether my gamble had simply provoked them into abandoning restraint entirely, rather than achieving the outcome I had hoped for. Then, unexpectedly, station traffic control interrupted the frequency, their voice carrying obvious alarm. Coalition vessels, be advised, unauthorized weapons discharge within civilian traffic zones has been reported directly to Regional Oversight Committee. Multiple independent witnesses have already submitted formal complaints. Please confirm your engagement authorization status immediately. I nearly laughed out loud with disbelief and relief. Corvo Station's traffic control, along with countless traders and independent operators who had clearly been listening to my broadcast, had apparently wasted no time reporting exactly what they witnessed to whatever regional oversight actually held authority over coalition enforcement actions within civilian space. The lead coalition vessel hesitated visibly on our sensors, its trajectory slowing as clearly urgent internal communication passed between the remaining formation members. Whatever quiet authority they had originally relied upon to justify seizing or destroying a supposedly obscure salvage vessel had just been thoroughly compromised by an audience they had never anticipated needing to consider. Nova, status update, I said quietly, hardly daring to hope. Coalition formation trajectory indicates deceleration and formation adjustment consistent with disengagement preparation. They were pulling back. I sat in stunned silence, watching through the viewport as the 3 remaining vessels gradually altered course, clearly abandoning their original intention, rather than risk further exposure under increasingly public scrutiny. Whatever fear had originally driven this operation, it apparently did not extend to withstanding open accountability in front of witnesses who could no longer be conveniently silenced or ignored. "They're actually leaving," I whispered, disbelief coloring every word. Confirmed. Coalition formation, withdrawing from engagement zone. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my hands began shaking uncontrollably against the console, weeks of accumulated tension finally releasing all at once. I sat there for a long moment, simply breathing, watching the retreating formation shrink steadily smaller against the dark backdrop of space. My communicator buzzed urgently, Grace's voice immediately flooding through the moment I answered. "Ethan, are you okay? I heard everything, the whole station heard everything. People are already talking about what you said, about the logs, about everything you just revealed." "I'm okay," I said, exhaustion and relief mixing together in my voice. "We're okay. This isn't over, you know that, right? You just told half the sector something their government spent generations trying to bury. That's not something people just forget about." "I know," I said, glancing around the battle-scarred bridge, at the dim consoles slowly stabilizing back toward normal operation, at the ship that had spent generations waiting silently for someone willing to finally let its story be heard again. "But I think that's exactly the point. Some truths don't stay buried forever, no matter how hard people try." Nova's voice returned then, calm and steady despite everything we had just endured together. "Commander, this unit has detected significant increase in incoming communication requests from various sources across the sector, including several independent journalists, historical researchers, and at least one representative claiming to speak for surviving descendants of dispersed Terran populations." I sat back in the command chair, staring out at the quiet expanse of space where the coalition formation had finally vanished from view entirely, understanding slowly that whatever ordinary life I had once known as a struggling scrap dealer had permanently changed the moment I placed that first winning bid weeks earlier. I had walked into that auction hall expecting nothing more than another long-shot gamble, another attempt to scrape together enough credits to survive one more month among the fringes of civilized space. Instead, I had found something the galaxy had spent generations trying desperately to forget, a truth buried, not because it was dangerous in the way people originally feared, but because remembering it demanded an uncomfortable reckoning that entire governments had preferred avoiding entirely. "Nova," I said quietly, watching the stars stretch endlessly beyond the viewport, "I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us." "Confirmed, Commander," she replied, something almost warm coloring her synthesized voice for the first time since I had first stepped aboard. "This unit looks forward to it." Outside, Corvo Station continued its familiar rotation, though nothing about the quiet corner of space surrounding my newly awakened ship would ever return entirely to how it had been before. The galaxy had spent generations believing that certain truths belonged buried in silence, that certain histories were safer forgotten than remembered. They had called my ship junk, unworthy of even a passing glance during that crowded auction night. They had been wrong about that from the very beginning, and now, finally, the rest of the galaxy was about to learn exactly how wrong they truly were.